no to begin with, they went through this. Saying no again at that point might not be a good opportunity. You might want to wait, right? And teach that skill when they're back at baseline, okay? So it's really to help you to start in essence, starting that recovery process, okay? I also want to say this is important for you too. You guys have just gone through a peak behavior. You probably were on a behavior cycle where there might have been some early escalation or escalation. You also need to come back down. You need to de-escalate. So if that means after they've started to, they are safe, you take a break. You go get water. You model that for them. That is really going to be important, okay? Because your needs are just as important as your child's. I'm a big believer in if you aren't there to take care of your child, who is, right? So if you don't take care of yourself, that's never going to happen. So what you can see is some of these is that they might be breathing slower, they might be sitting quietly, they might accept water. I would say a lot of times, I've seen kiddos, especially if it's a really intense peak behavior, they might go to sleep, they might want water, they might want like a cooling rack because, I mean, if you think about it, when you're escalated, you're hot, your face gets flushed, right? They might be able to answer some simple questions. What you need to do is allow for space, sit like quietly nearby. What I like to say is, you let me know when you're ready. And I'll check in maybe every 5 or 10 minutes. I won't tell them that I'm going to, but hey, are you okay? Are we ready to move forward? Whatever it may look like for your child.
Yeah, sometimes you just go inside the room and your kid, because once you start talking, really.
Yeah, exactly. That could be a trigger. Yeah, target. I tried to say hi and boom, right back up, right? So yeah, it might just be that you kind of like look in, check that they're okay, step back out. Really knowing your child, knowing what's going to be best. They might come to you, you might have to go to them, just whatever works best. I think the biggest piece is really trying to provide that calm response. So if they're in their room, that's your time to de-escalate as well too, right? Get that water, take that breath, whatever you need. Okay, so returning back to baseline, I think this is one of the biggest pieces. Recovery is a major part of the behavior cycle, and understanding its importance can prevent additional situations from happening in the future. If we don't allow for the de-escalation, they're going to be constantly in a heightened state. What happens when your cortisol rises? Lots of medical issues can happen with that, and I don't want that to happen either, right? So we want to be able to get them back down to baseline and recovery. So returning to baseline, they're able to return back to what their baseline levels of regulation are. Learning and reflection are possible, okay? Your goal is to reconnect, rebuild, repair, and teach those skills. And I think that's a really big piece that I think is hard for parents. You might have just been aggressed on, you might have had to deal with the cops, right? Or a crisis unit that came into your house because it's gotten so escalated. In those situations, it's really important for you to reconnect with your child. I don't want to tell you how to do that because it's going to be different for each person. But I think that's why it's really important that while they're de-escalating, you are also de-escalating. Because if you are still at a heightened state and you try to reconnect, they're going to feel that energy. I don't have a behavior way to explain that, but I feel like energy is felt, right? You know if someone is doing something, like they have a positive energy, they have a negative energy. Other BCBAs will laugh at me and say that's not analytical, but I like it. I think it's true. I wish I could come up with a behavior term for it, but I really do. My behavior is going to influence their behavior and vice versa. So I guess that's the best way to put it in behavior analytic terms, but I think that is really important. So I'm almost done, I promise. What does this look like? They might be able to engage in conversation with you. They return to previous activities. They accept support like help. I think that's a big one. I'm going to imagine in peak, they're not going to want your help. They're going to be like, get the heck away from me. But at this point, they're going to be able to accept that. They're going to demonstrate some flexibility, and they're going to be able to utilize those coping strategies. For you, you're going to reestablish those routines, okay? You're going to reinforce those recovery behaviors. So whatever that looks like, maybe we're talking about what coping strategies we could use next time, or we're practicing some of those coping strategies, right? So we have them ready for next time. I think the discuss the situation, and I put if appropriate, depends on the level of your child and what their ability is to understand that. Sometimes that can re-trigger the event. We don't want that to happen, right? Sometimes we just need to move on. But we're gonna talk about coping strategies instead, but not related back to what just happened. Teach alternative responses or replacement behaviors. Let's say they were asking for cookie, but you didn't know what the heck they were asking for. They were just randomly pointing at the cupboard and you couldn't figure out what they were asking. That's what led to it. We're gonna try to figure it out in those baseline moments. We're gonna present them with choices and then teach them how to request that, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but this talks about the differences of the functions of behavior. That's a whole other training. That's something Alexi is going to be putting on coming up in the summer. So really the biggest piece though is understanding what the function was is going to help to decrease that over time. Like I said, if you can meet that same need in a more socially appropriate way, I teach you now how to request for cookie rather than you just hit me to get cookie, we're gonna come up with a better, more socially appropriate way. So I just put on there what the 4 functions of behavior are, and Krista and I had a really long conversation because I think a lot of what happens is the kid wants control in that moment, right? Their body is feeling out of control, they want control. I feel like that falls under what's called automatic reinforcement. It's not considered socially mediated, which means that it is, they do it to access pleasure or to attenuate pain. So if they have a headache, they might be hitting their head because they have a headache. They want control over that piece of their head and they have no way to communicate that to you. They might want control over the environment to have access to their iPad. So hitting you, you give them their iPad, that's giving them that access, right? They're controlling the situation in that. But like I said, that could be something that, or is going to be something that Lexi will talk a little bit more about in her trainings coming up. Okay, I put some examples of some replacement skills that you can put on there. Okay, sorry, I skipped some of my activities because I talked too much. I apologize, you guys. I think the key takeaways here, though, are that behavioral escalations does follow a pattern, but knowing that it's not linear is going to be really important. They might go from the trigger to peak escalation, right? It doesn't have to go through that whole cycle. Prevention is definitely more powerful than reaction. Early signs matter because you can attack it sooner. Safety should always come first, and recovery is that teaching opportunity, okay? So I put on here, I won't go through this, but on your guys' it has the stage of the behavior cycle and what you guys should be focusing on, okay? So like for baseline, that's where you teach skills. Triggers, you're being supportive and reassuring, okay? So it kind of just breaks it down, gives you a little bit of what should you do in those moments, okay? So you don't have to go back through the entire thing and try to figure out what you need to do. Okay, we are at the end of our time, but do you guys